to introducing this second plenary of the conference, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Erez Levon to you this morning. Erez, who many of you know, is Reader in Sociolinguistics at Queen Mary University of London. He's well known for having research interests in sociolinguistics, gender and sexuality, language style, indexicality, social cognition, intersectionality, and for doing work based in Israel and South Africa. He's actually one of the key driving forces at the moment behind work on language, sexuality, and intersectionality. Erez is primarily interested in examining how language, gender, and sexuality intersect with other categories of lived experience. He has conducted important work on language, sexuality, and conflict, exploring how people negotiate subjective conflict and how language participates in that process. His groundbreaking work on sexuality and nationalism in Israel used sociolinguistic tools and methods to examine how people confront normative incompatibilities between their sexuality and their national, ethnic, and religious identifications. This is a research area which is seen as taboo and risky by many, in line with the theme of this conference. For the past 2 years, Erez has been working with Tommaso Milani on a project examining representations of men and masculinities in the English language South African print media. His talk today focuses on another aspect of his most recent work, which examines phonological innovations in the southeast of England, in which he focuses primarily on intonation and the spread of high-rising terminals, or uptalk. Erez is the author of Language and the Politics of Sexuality, published by Palgrave in 2010, and he's co-editor of Language, Sexuality and Power, Studies in Intersectional Sociolinguistics, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. He has also authored and co-authored numerous book chapters and journal articles. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Erez to you this morning, and his talk today is entitled Language, Indexicality and Gender Ideologies, Contextual Effects on the Perceived Credibility of Women. Erez, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is this microphone working? Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much, Helen, for your introduction. Thank you very much to the organizing committee. I'm very honored to have been invited, and in particular, and forgive the reference, that they took the risk of inviting me. I say it's a risk because I don't often focus in my work as much as I could on how my research and the findings of my research can be applied to address problems in the real world. So preparing this talk really encouraged me to think more about how what I study affects people's lives and how my own work can potentially lead to addressing real-world language issues. Now, in the very briefest terms, and as Helen summarized, in my work, I'm interested in how social meanings get associated with particular ways of speaking, and then how speakers take advantage of these associations in creative and strategic ways in their own linguistic practice. Now, most of my work in this area has focused on gender and sexuality, so what people assume sounds like a gendered way of speaking, and how those assumptions then affect how people are able to navigate the social world. Now, because of my interest in gender, when I started thinking about what kinds of real-world language issues I could address for this talk, I was reminded of feminist theorist Lee Gilmore's statement in her recent book entitled Tainted Witness, that judgment falls unequally on women who bear witness. Gilmore makes this statement by way of an introduction to an analysis of the ways in which women's testimony, women's own accounts of their experiences, are delegitimized in various public and institutional settings. For Gilmore, the source of this delegitimizing are patterns of long-standing structural and symbolic inequity, which she calls deep reservoirs of bias, that circulate and are normative in society, and that ultimately serve to render women less believable. Now, Gilmore describes this process by saying that those who put forward personal accounts of suffering and those who encounter them form a transactional dynamic of testimony. When the witness is a woman, she will be subjected to practices of shaming and discrediting that pre-exist any specific case. In other words, social ideologies about gender and the gendered order are such that women's epistemic authority, their own understandings of their lives and their experiences, is normatively subject to challenge in ways that men's understandings of their experiences are not. So how does this then relate to language and linguistics? Well, in describing her analytical project, Gilmore claims that although truth appears to name the deep essence that witness accounts must offer, and which audiences seek to plumb, the practices by which these accounts are produced and judged lie on the surface, and they demand scrutiny. It's clear that what Gilmore is describing here is a linguistic question. How is truth constructed? How is truth perceived? And how is this dynamic negotiation of what counts as truth affected by gender ideologies? This is what demands scrutiny, and it's one part of this issue that I will be addressing today. Now, I should note that I'm by no means the first person to discuss this question in relation to linguistics. There's a long history of research, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, examining how gender, language, and perceived credibility interact. To cite just one very recent example, Nicole Hildebrand Edgar and Susan Ehrlich have argued that covert sexism and gendered ideologies are intimately connected to the relationship between language practices and credibility. So in my talk, I'd like to build on the work of Hildebrand Edgar, Ehrlich, and others in order to relate the question of language, gender, and credibility to the specific kinds of linguistic practices and stereotypes that I focus on in my own work, and in doing so, hopefully build a bridge between the kinds of issues that variationists like me often address and broader, more practical concerns. So just to give you a brief outline of the talk, I'm going to start by reviewing the particular speech variable that I'll be investigating. And as Helen mentioned, this is uptalk, and I'll say in a second what that is. I'll then go through a very quick overview of what I mean by credibility and how we can test it. And in the bulk of my discussion, I'll present results from 2 experiments that I've recently ran examining how gender and language affect perceived credibility in 2 simulated courtroom contexts. Now, the first of these courtroom contexts involves a medical malpractice trial, and the second one deals with an issue that may be troubling for some people, so I wanted to flag this up. And this is a courtroom context dealing with issues of rape and sexual violence. When discussing the second context, I will not be playing the testimony for you or describing the violence in detail, but I will be discussing people's attitudes towards gender and rape, as well as presenting results related to the perceived credibility of rape victims. And I appreciate that this could be difficult for some people to listen to, so I will signpost later in the talk when I get to that discussion. Okay, so uptalk. This is what I'm going to be talking about, and this is a feature that I've been working on for the past few years, and specifically in the London context. For those who are unfamiliar with it, uptalk refers to what has been defined as a marked rising intonation pattern in spoken language that is found at the end of intonation units realized on declarative utterances. In simpler terms, then, this is the use of what's normally considered question intonation in English, standardly question intonation, that is a rise at the end of a phrase, but being used on declarative sentences, and in varieties where this doesn't normally happen. So there are varieties of British English, particularly in the north, in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, where you do normally get rises at the ends of declarative utterances, but in standard Southern British English, this is a marked thing to occur. So let me give you some examples. You can see these are pitch tracks on both the left and the right. I'll play these for you, but just before I play them, what you're seeing is an intonational phrase, and then you see that in both of them, the pitch rises, either this very steep rise in the pitch track on the left, or a somewhat less steep rise in the pitch track on the right. And so in the first one, she is saying, and we met in Spanish.
And we met in Spanish.
Yeah, I'll play that again.
And we met in Spanish.
And in the second one, she's saying, we met here at uni.
We met here at uni. We met here at uni.
So both of these are declarative utterances. We would normally assume that this would be accompanied by falling intonation in Southern British English, and instead here we have rises. And so this is the feature that I'm going to be looking at. Now, uptalk is standardly assumed to have emerged, to have begun in Australia in the 1960s, before spreading quickly to New Zealand very shortly thereafter. And these are still the regions where we are associated with the most amounts of uptalk today. It then moved to the United States, where it arrived in the 1970s and became stereotypical of Valley Girl talk, and also made it into Robin Lakoff's famous list of women's language features. It then appeared in Canada in the early 1980s and in the UK shortly thereafter. It was first attested by Alan Cruttenden in his book Intonation in 1987, where he said it was a feature of the speech of young, upwardly mobile Londoners, or yuppie talk, as he called it. The feature still appears to be spreading throughout the English-speaking world, so there's anecdotal evidence of its occurrence now in South African English, though I'm not aware of any research that has tested that yet. But it's a very robust feature of Englishes around the globe. And wherever it's appeared, uptalk has been stereotypically associated with young women, and with all the stereotypical baggage and associations that this kind of association brings with it. Now, this is despite the fact that in pretty much all cases, there's actually no evidence that women use uptalk more than men, right? So in every place that it's been studied, results have found that men are using uptalk at the same rates, if not more, than women are. And this is definitely what I found in my own work in London. So this is in a paper that I published in 2016. I analyzed recordings of the naturally occurring speech in small group interactions of 72 young Londoners, and found that men were actually more frequent users of uptalk than women were. So you can see that the men here, the white men here on the right of the plot are using uptalk 19% of the time, whereas the women are using it about 10.5% of the time. We can see, too, also in this plot, that in London, at least, uptalk is a feature that's fairly overwhelmingly used by white speakers, and specifically white middle-class speakers. And this is also a pattern that we find around the world. In London, Black and Asian speakers don't use uptalk in any sort of systematic way. You do see that they use it sometimes, but it's not as systematic as it is in white London speech. Now, without going into the details of my analysis of what uptalk's actually doing, I'm just going to present the findings for you. And in this paper in 2016, I argue that while both women and men in London use uptalk, they use it to do slightly different things. So for women, uptalk is used to request what Tanya Stivers describes as activity alignment in conversation, a way to keep participants in a conversation on track. And this is particularly the case when women's conversational or epistemic authority is threatened. Uptalk is used to maintain control of the direction of a conversation, but to do so in a non-threatening and non-challenging way. The men, in contrast, use uptalk to request what's been described as interactional affiliation, as a tool for involving others in the evolving narrative, but also as a way to pull focus or attention. I like to describe it as a sort of look at me, look at me, look at me, look at how great I am. And that's what the men are using it to do. So for both, uptalk is serving a very nuanced politeness function, but the specifics of that function and what it's supposed to do are somewhat different. So for the men, it's about, I want you to like me, look at how great I am. For the women, I want you to pay attention to me, look at how authoritative I am. But for both, again, in a friendly, polite way. But this complex distribution and functional specification of uptalk is totally lost in how it's stereotypically represented. Uptalk is generally heard, and particularly generally heard in women's voices, as indicating a lack of authority or credibility. If you just type uptalk into Google, which is what I did to get this image, you'll get all sorts of recommendations and courses on how to remove uptalk for your speech, how bad uptalk would be for you, for example, in an interview or when you're trying to sound authoritative. But crucially, this stereotypical representation is precisely the opposite of how young women in London use the feature. So in my work, again, I found that those who use uptalk do so to assert their authority when that authority is being challenged. And it's this mismatch between how uptalk is actually used and how it's stereotypically perceived, and the potential real-world ramifications of this mismatch that is of interest to me today. So just to present a couple research questions, I'll be addressing how does the presence of uptalk affect listeners' evaluations of the perceived credibility of a speaker, and then how are these evaluations affected by the gendered ideologies of different legal contexts. I'm going to quickly talk about how I'm operationalizing credibility as the sort of perceptual construct of interest. I'm going to be focusing on credibility of witnesses in legal contexts. There's actually a great deal of work, as I'm sure many of you know, on this subject of witness credibility in the psychology literature and in the literature in socio-legal studies. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all the various arguments and models that have been proposed, including what the cognitive status of credibility is and how we relate credibility to things like persuasion and things like that. Instead, I'm just going to present the widely accepted construct of witness credibility as it's reflected in the witness credibility scale, which was developed by Stanley Brodsky and colleagues. Now, according to the witness credibility scale, credibility as a psychological construct is composed of 4 interrelated components: confidence, likability, trustworthiness, and knowledge. And then you'll see in this sort of pie diagram that there's also then this bit that I've called other, which is just sort of then a gut feeling that you have. So I perceive how credible you are based on how confident I perceive you as being, how trustworthy, how likable, how knowledgeable, and then I've also just got this little gut feeling in addition. So when we talk about perceived credibility, and when I'm going to be talking about perceived credibility, you can refer to any one of these components or to the measure of as a whole, but today I'll be focusing on individual components of credibility. Now, in addition to the work in psychology, there's also a long tradition of research on the topic of credibility in sociolinguistics, and particularly in language and law studies. Early work by John Conley, William O'Barr, and Bauman Atkins describe different styles of speech by witnesses in court, making the famous distinction between more powerful and more powerless speech styles. Subsequent research confirmed that powerful versus powerless speech styles correlated with greater or lesser perceived credibility, indicating that listeners pay attention to linguistic form in addition to content when making these kinds of judgments. And finally, as I've already mentioned, recent work by Hildebrand Edgar and Ehrlich has extended our understanding in this area, demonstrating that linguistic indices of credibility are also filtered through gendered ideologies. So in their work, Hildebrand Edgar and Ehrlich find that women victims of sexual assault are perceived as sounding too assertive to be victims when they use these more powerful speech styles. So even though we normally assume that powerful speech is associated with perceptions of credibility, Hildebrand Edgar and Ehrlich show that this actually depends on the specific gendered ideologies that are involved in a given context. And it's that importance of social context that I will be exploring as well today. Okay, so even though I've gone through this somewhat quickly, we have the basic building blocks in place for the experiments that I'm going to be talking about. We know from the psychology literature what it means to sound credible in terms of the internal structure of credibility as a psychological construct. We know that specific forms of language are indexical of the traits that comprise credibility. And we know that these indexical links between linguistic forms and speaker traits are affected by dominant social ideologies. And then it's these 3 pieces of the puzzle that I'll be looking at in terms of uptalk. Before going on, I want to thank Yang Yi, who's my collaborator on this project. Yang is a postdoctoral researcher at Queen Mary with me. And together, Yang and I developed and ran 2 perception experiments to look at the effect of uptalk on perceived credibility. Both experiments were run online with participants recruited via Prolific, which is an online recruitment platform that's UK-based. So for those who are familiar with it, it's sort of the UK version of Amazon's Mechanical Turk. The respondents all live in the UK and listed having English as one of their native languages. In each experiment, listeners heard extracts from a real trial, so from real trial testimony, but that had been recorded by actors, right? And the actors were one woman and one man, both speakers of standard Southern British English in their late 20s. In both of these experiments, the recordings had been digitally manipulated so as to contain uptalk or not, right? So I went back after the actors recorded them and either made it a falling intonation or a rising intonation, so for presentation in the experimental context. After hearing the recorded testimony, the online listeners rated the witness on 3 components of the witness credibility scale. So confidence, likability, and trustworthiness. Even though there's normally a 4th component, knowledge or knowledgeability, I left that off for reasons that I can discuss later. So it's just confidence, likability, and trustworthiness. After rating the witnesses, then listeners answered questions about their own beliefs and opinions on various social issues. So this is what the 2 experiments shared, a sort of basic experimental paradigm that was the same for both. But where they differed was in the specific context of the witness testimony. And note that here I will be describing some of the potentially troubling details in relation to the 2nd experimental context. In the first experiment, recordings were of expert medical testimony in a medical malpractice trial. The testimony was taken from a textbook that is commonly used in teaching lawyers how to examine expert medical witnesses or expert witnesses in general. So again, this is actual testimony that's been used in court. And it's basically, you'll see, or actually, I'm not sure you won't see the testimony. It's basically a doctor describing why a patient died while in the operating theater, and a doctor describing whether they thought that the surgeon who was doing the operation was at fault or not. After hearing the testimony, they rated the witnesses, and then they filled in a survey called the Ambivalent Sexism Inventory. This is a survey that essentially evaluates the extent to which respondents or listeners endorse various sexist stereotypes. It tests both what's called hostile sexism, so beliefs that women should, the sort of hostile beliefs that are misogynistic, as well as benevolent sexism. So these are issues more like protective paternalism and other kinds of ways in which sexist ideologies can be perpetuated, even though they're not necessarily hostile to women in a sense. There were 142 respondents for this first experiment. 2/3 of them identified as women with a mean age of just over 36. And there was a range in age from 18 up to 66, so a fairly good spread of respondents. In the second experiment, recordings were of testimony given by a woman complainant and a man defendant in a rape trial. And this testimony was taken from Susan Ehrlich's published work on a rape tribunal in Canada. In this context, listeners heard testimony from both, so both the complainant and the defendant, and the order in which they heard that was varied across respondents. After hearing the testimony and after they'd rated both the witnesses on the witness credibility scale, the respondents then once again filled in the ambivalent sexism inventory, and then they also filled an updated version of the Illinois Rape Myth Acceptance Scale. Now, the Rape Myth Acceptance Scale is a standard psychological measure, once again, that's designed to test the extent to which respondents endorse what Martha Burt and others have called rape myths, or that is, false beliefs about rape shaped by sexism and other forms of gendered ideology. So what I'm doing here is I'm getting both a measure of essentially the extent to which somebody endorses sexist beliefs, and then more specifically, the extent to which somebody endorses specific myths about rape. And these rape myths that are tested in this updated version of the IRMA scale there are 4 of them. She asked for it, he didn't mean to, it wasn't really rape, and she lied, right? So these are the myths around rape that the scale is designed to test the extent to which people endorse them. For this experiment, there were 315 usable responses, once again, around 2/3 women, and a mean age that's similar at 37.3. Okay, so we're going to turn directly to the first experiment. So this is the expert witness context. And here you see the instructions that the respondents were given. So they were told in this study, you will hear testimony provided by an expert witness in a medical malpractice trial. In the case, a surgeon and an anesthesiologist are accused of negligence in their handling of complications that arose during a routine procedure. These complications resulted in the patient suffering permanent brain damage. The patient's family asserts that the brain damage could have been prevented had the surgeon and the anesthesiologist not been negligent. The doctors claim to have done everything in their power to prevent the brain damage. You will hear an audio recording of part of the testimony given by an expert medical witness in the trial. In the recording, the witness provides an expert opinion about what might have happened during the surgery as per available evidence, and who is responsible for the patient's brain damage. And after receiving these instructions, the respondents went directly into the experiment, heard the one version of the testimony. So they either heard a man or a woman reading the same testimony or acting out the same testimony, and again, either with uptalk or without uptalk, and then rated the recording that they heard on the witness credibility scale. Just to give you a general overview of how credibility was assessed in this first experiment. So remember, I'm only using 3 elements of the scale, so confidence, likability, and trustworthiness. And looking at these 3 components, we see that in this experiment, in the expert witness context, trustworthiness is the most important component of credibility for the listeners at 29%. Now, in the original formulation of the witness credibility scale, it's actually confidence that is the most important. So I'm seeing a slight difference here. Here, it seems like respondents are paying more attention to whether they find someone trustworthy, and then followed by confidence and likability. Okay. In terms of witness gender overall, and here we have men, responses for the man expert medical witness in orange on the right, and the woman in gray on the left, and it'll consistently be orange for the man and gray for the woman throughout the talk. In terms of witness gender overall, it's somewhat heartening to see that there were no differences across any of these scales for the woman expert witness versus the man expert witness. Both were perceived as sounding very confident, with an average score of over 6 out of 7. Pretty trustworthy, with an average score of right around 5.7 out of 7. And fairly likable, with an average score of right around 5.2 for both. So generally, gender does not seem to be affecting perceived credibility of an expert witness overall, which is, I think, a good thing, right? And I was, again, pleasantly surprised when I saw this. But don't worry, the pleasant surprises won't last for very long. OK, but what about uptalk? Well, before we actually get to the results, let me play you an example of the contrast that listeners heard so you can hear how this was manipulated. The expert witness testimony that people listened to was about a minute long, and it contained 28 intonational phrases. In the no uptalk condition, all of these phrases ended with falling intonation. In the uptalk condition, 7 of the 28, or 25%, ended with rising intonation. And this rising intonation was designed such that it matched both in terms of its placement within the extract and its acoustic shape, such that it matched the typical rising intonation patterns found for uptalk in London. So in terms of how quickly it rose, where precisely the rise was taking place, how large the rise was, all of that was designed to parallel what I found in the production study that I'd done in London. OK, so let me play you an example sentence. So what the speakers are going to be saying is, that means no one noticed that her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes. Let's hear the woman's version first. On the top, you've got the no uptalk condition. And once again, you can see the pitch track. It's fairly flat and then drops at the end. Whereas on the bottom, it's the uptalk condition, fairly flat, and then a sharp rise at the end. Oh, I have to turn this up.
That means no one noticed her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes.
Can you hear that? OK. So once again, this is the falling condition.
That means no one noticed her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes.
And then the rising condition.
That means no one noticed her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes. That means no one noticed her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes.
OK. And same thing for the man. Once again, on the top, we have the falling condition. So there you see it's pretty much just flat across the board. Whereas on the bottom, we have the rising condition. We get this sharp peak right at the end.
That means no one noticed that her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes. That means no one noticed that her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes.
And then the rising condition.
That means no one noticed that her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes. That means no one noticed that her heart had stopped for over 5 minutes.
OK, so in both cases, for both the woman and the man, everything in the extracts is identical because this was a digital manipulation. Everything is identical except for the very end of the intonational phrase with the presence or absence of uptalk. And remember, the listeners only heard either the man or the woman in either uptalk or no uptalk. So it's a fully between subjects design. So when looking at the potential effect of uptalk in this expert witness context, of the 3 credibility components, the only place we find an effect of uptalk is on perceived confidence. Again, here we have the results for the man in orange on the right and for the woman in gray on the left. And we see that the effect, this uptalk effect, is the same for the woman and the man. For both, the presence of uptalk, and that's in the darker bars, causes a decrease in the perceived confidence of the witness. This effect appears to be slightly larger for the man, but that interaction is not statistically significant. So what we have is a simple effect that affects both equally. Uptalk makes the witness sound less confident. This effect is, in addition, consistent across the listener population. So there are no differences in terms of the listener's gender, the listener's age, the listener's score on the ambivalent sexism inventory. All 142 listeners basically thought that the presence of uptalk made an expert witness sound less confident than no uptalk. So, as I've just said, we see that uptalk affects the perceived confidence of an expert witness. Now, when we think about what confidence is in terms of the witness credibility scale, confidence measures basically, in the terms of this particular scale that I'm using, how self-assured, how well-spoken, how poised, and how relaxed a witness sounds. And these are the factors that are being affected by uptalk. Now, what this means is that uptalk seems to affect perceptions of a witness's performance in the moment. how sure they are about what it is that they're talking about, as opposed to a more durable characteristic of the speaker. So not how reliable they are as a person, how honest they are as a person. It's just about how confident are you right now, right? And we see that this uptalk effect, again, is consistent for both witnesses and throughout the listener population. So ultimately, this result is consistent with the interpretation of uptalk, the interpretation of this feature, as what Sunwoo Jung has recently called an inquisitive rise, that is marking a piece of information that I'm not sure about. So we have rises that are heard as inquisitive. I'm saying this, I'm going to use a little rise to signal to you that I'm not feeling very confident about what I'm saying. Now, this interpretation is consistent with the stereotype of uptalk that circulates and that I talked about earlier, but it is the opposite of how speakers in London actually use the form, right? So we're getting a stereotype consistent interpretation in this expert witness condition. Okay, let's move on to the next experimental context. Once again, this is where I'm going to be discussing some issues that are potentially troubling or uncomfortable for some people. So in this second experiment in the rape trial context, here are the instructions that respondents saw. In this study, you will hear testimony provided by parties to a sexual assault trial. In the case in question, Marge, the complainant, has charged that Matt, the defendant, sexually assaulted her one night in her university accommodation. Marge asserts that she invited Matt to her room that night and that he persisted in unwanted sexual behavior. Matt claims, in contrast, that the sexual activity was consensual. You will hear testimony given by both Marge and Matt and will be asked to give your opinions about each of them based on what you hear. Okay, so as I said before, unlike in the first experiment, listeners in this experiment heard testimony from both witnesses, and the order was counterbalanced. So half of them heard Marge's testimony first, followed by Matt's, and the other half the other way around. Okay, so as I did before, let's just look at a quick overview of how credibility is understood for the participants in this experiment, and this time I'm separating it out by the complainant, Marge, and the defendant, Matt. There's a similar structure overall as what we saw for the expert witness context. Once again, trustworthiness appears to be the most important credibility construct, followed here, however, by likability and then confidence. So this already shows you that when we're talking about how credible does someone sound, it seems like listeners are listening for slightly different things depending on the situation in which they need to make these kinds of judgments. Okay. I'm going to continue discussing the results of this experiment by separating Marge and Matt, and you'll see why very shortly. So let's start with Marge. So this is the complainant, the woman. We're going to start with the uptalk effect. We see that overall, for all three components, uptalk has no effect. So if we look at perceived confidence, perceived trustworthiness, perceived likability, the bars are at about the same height, right? The complainant is generally heard as slightly trustworthy, so slightly over halfway on the scale, somewhat likable, and neither confident nor lacking in confidence. And this is unaffected by whether there is uptalk in her testimony or not, right? This is interesting when we compare this to the result from the expert witness context, where we just saw this very robust effect of uptalk affecting perceived confidence, right? Actually, uptalk having a detrimental effect on perceived confidence. And at least this difference in the findings between the rape trial context and the expert witness context, it provides evidence for the importance of specific context in determining how uptalk is interpreted. We do, however, find a highly significant effect of order on perceptions of the complainant's credibility. So I realize this plot is a bit supercharged. So what I'm plotting here is basically you've got uptalk versus no uptalk. And again, uptalk is the darker bars. No uptalk is the lighter bars. And then they're separated by order. So we have on the right-hand side of each of the three plots whether Marge was heard before Matt, so whether her testimony was heard before the defendant's testimony, or whether her testimony was heard after the defendant's testimony. Now, when we look at this, we see that across the board, the complainant is judged as sounding less trustworthy, less likable, and less confident when respondents heard the defendant's testimony and then the complainant's testimony. So when Marge testifies after Matt, I've heard the defendant's side of the story, and now I'm going to hear Marge's side of the story. I think that Marge is less trustworthy, less likable, and less confident. In contrast, when I hear Marge first, I think she sounds more of all these things. Now, uptalk still has no significant effect. Instead, it's just the defendant's testimony that appears to undermine the complainant's credibility, right? Now, this could be just about the amount of information available to listeners, right? So I have more information when I've heard the defendant's testimony, and then I'm going to hear the complainant's testimony. I have another side of the story, so I'm just going to try and be fair and think that, maybe you're a bit less trustworthy. So it could just be that this other side of the story downgrades Marge's perceived credibility. Or this could be related to some kind of gender effect or role effect. Could it be that women are generally more susceptible to having their testimony doubted, or that victims in these kinds of contexts are more susceptible to have their testimony doubted? Based just on looking at Marge's testimony, we're unable to differentiate whether this is just an information order effect or a gender/role effect. But I'll come back to this point in a second. There is, however, one more interesting pattern in relation to Marge's testimony that I just want to talk about briefly. And here, this is the relationship between the order effect and respondent scores on the rape myth acceptance scale. So I've divided the respondent scores into low, average, and high. And I've separated things out by order again. And I'm just giving you an example here from the perceived trustworthiness scale. Now, we see that for respondents with a low or average score on the scale, which means that they don't really endorse or only partially endorse the relevant rape myths, the order effect remains, and the complainant sounds less credible when she's heard after the defendant. So this is the pattern that I just showed you before, right? So when Marge is heard after Matt, she sounds less credible. And we find this for people who don't or only slightly or partially endorse the rape myths. For respondents with very high rape myth acceptance scores, however, those on the right of the plot, and these are people who largely endorse the relevant rape myths, the order effect disappears. And instead, the complainant is heard as sounding equally lacking in credibility no matter what order she's heard in, right? So, and you can see that overall, the bars are lower than they are for the other RMA respondents, which basically means that any benefit of the doubt that some listeners that is given to Marge by some listeners, that is those who score low or average on the rape myth acceptance scale, disappears when they're high on the rape myth acceptance scale, right? So that's why we're not finding this order effect. Instead, we have certain respondents, those who score highly on this scale, who appear already predisposed to doubt the complainant. So she doesn't get any boost from being heard first, as she does for other listeners. Okay, so just to review what we've seen for Marge in this rape trial context, there's no effective uptalk, which is potentially surprising, but also seems to indicate that we need to be paying close attention to the context in which linguistic features are heard and perceived. There's a significant effect of order, though it's unclear what that order effect may actually mean. So we know that the complainant is heard as less credible when heard after the defendant, and that could be a gender role effect, or what I'm calling a true order effect, which is just related to the amount of information available to you when you're making a credibility judgment. And then we do also, though, see that that order effect is moderated by the rape myth acceptance scale, which appears to differentiate between listeners who give the complainant the benefit of the doubt, and these are primarily listeners who don't endorse rape myths, versus those that don't. Okay, so that's for Marge. Let's now turn to Matt, the defendant. Now, unlike the complainant, we see that for the defendant, there is a significant effect of uptalk on perceived trustworthiness and perceived likability, such that for both these traits, trustworthiness and likability, the presence of uptalk, and again, this is the darker bars, enhances these components of the defendant's credibility. So when Matt has uptalk, he sounds more trustworthy and more likable. This isn't a huge effect, but it is a significant one. And it means that with uptalk, the defendant, as I've just said, sounds more likable and more trustworthy, though this has no effect on confidence. So again, we've got a difference from what we found in the expert witness context, where there was a downgrading of perceived confidence for the man with uptalk. And this was the same man's voice. I should maybe note that. Same man's voice in the other experiment. Whereas here, we're getting an upgrading of trustworthiness and likability. And it's interesting to note, I said before that in the expert witness context, confidence, perceived confidence, is about evaluation of a speaker in the moment. How are you doing right now? How confident do you sound in what you're saying right now? Whereas things like trustworthiness and likability are more durable properties of an individual. Do I think you're honest? Do I think you're reliable? Do I think you're friendly? And these are the things that are being enhanced by the presence of uptalk in Matt's speech. So in this sense, in the rape trial context, the defendant, the man, is judged as more socially attractive when he uses uptalk. When we split things in terms of order, that is, whether the defendant was heard before the complainant or not, and remember, this is where we found a very robust effect for the complainant, for the woman, we see that here there is no order effect, right? Order has no impact on the perceived credibility of the defendant. So the defendant is heard as equally trustworthy, equally likable, and equally confident, whether his version of events is heard first or second, right? Now, this lack of an order effect for the defendant seems to indicate that the presence of such an effect for the complainant is more than just about access to additional information. It's not just, oh, I don't have another side of the story versus I do have another side of the story, because that doesn't matter for the defendant. Instead, it seems to be inherent in the role occupied by the complainant and the extent to which a complainant's version of events is susceptible to doubt. Finally, we also find a rape myth acceptance effect for the defendant, but here it is an independent effect that does not interact with any other patterns. Basically, what this effect says is that the more a listener endorses the relevant rape myths, the more likable and trustworthy they find the defendant to be. And this is perhaps unsurprising. I've illustrated this here with results from the likability scale, but it applies across the board. In all cases, we see that uptalk enhances the perceived likability, right? So the darker bar with uptalk is larger and significantly larger or higher than the lighter bar without uptalk. And this happens in tandem with a gradual progression across the three rape myth acceptance categories, so from low to average to medium, where we actually see what looks like a sort of upward ratchet. So the perceived likability of the defendant with uptalk for listeners who do not endorse the rape myths is about equivalent to the perceived likability of Matt without uptalk for listeners who partially endorse the rape myths. So we get this sort of stepwise progression of uptalk and rape myth acceptance working in tandem. So to summarize the results for Matt, unlike the complainant, we have an uptalk effect for the defendant, and it enhances his perceived credibility. Now, this seems to indicate that listeners here are interpreting uptalk as what Zhang has called an assertive rise. So whereas before I said that it would seem like they were interpreting uptalk in the expert witness condition as an inquisitive rise, I'm not sure what I'm talking about. Here it's an assertion, but it's an assertion of what Spencer Odie and others have called sociality rights. So I'm asserting my right or my desire to be liked, to be included, for you to listen to me and for you to like me and believe me, right? So this is different from the expert witness context, but actually matches what happens in practice. So this is how men in London use this feature. They use it in conversational interaction to say, you know, look at me, listen to me, be my friend, aren't I great? Listen to this cool thing that happened to me. Aren't I likable? Aren't I trustworthy? And this appears to be what listeners are getting from it. So they're actually matching what's happening in practice, but that's different than what happened in the expert witness context. Now, we have no order effect for the defendant, which I would argue seems to indicate that impressions of the defendant are somewhat more robust than impressions of the complainant. They're less resistant to variation or variability, less amenable to change, and less amenable to doubt. And then finally, we have a somewhat unsurprising main effect of the rape myth acceptance score, which operates in this ratchet pattern that I've described, such that the more you endorse these stereotypes or these rape myths, the more you're going to find the defendant believable and likable, and uptalk will have an independent effect that actually helps that process along. Okay, so I've gone through a bunch of different results, and I want to come back to the questions that I asked at the start. So let's start with this first one, which was just this very general question: how do listeners perceive uptalk? Well, it depends on the context, and that's what we've seen. In medical expert testimony, uptalk is interpreted as an inquisitive rise, and this inquisitive rise serves to detract from the perceived certainty of the speaker in the moment. Now, this is interesting because it's the opposite of what I found speakers to actually use uptalk to do. And this is a finding which has clear ramifications for successful communication in court, right? Or in any other kind of context. If in certain contexts, people are perceiving uptalk to mean I'm lacking in confidence, where I'm actually using it to show you that I have a great deal of confidence, there is a mismatch. And this mismatch could certainly lead to problems. We have an interesting and somewhat heartening lack of a gender effect in the medical context, and this could simply be related to the role in which, the sort of expert role that the speakers are occupying. Perhaps indicative that we're now more accepting of women in this role. It doesn't seem to us surprising to have a confident, authoritative, expert woman. That would obviously require more evidence, but there is no differentiation between the woman and the man in this context. But we find a very different pattern in the context of the rape trial, where here for the defendant, or the man, uptalk enhances aspects of perceived attractiveness, his trustworthiness, and his likability. And in this case, the perceptions actually match how men use this feature. But for women, in contrast, we have no effect. So we can't say that uptalk is doing anything for the woman in the rape myth context. Now, overall, then, this indicates that listeners are sensitive to uptalk, but it also means that uptalk means different things in different contexts. So not only does this give lie to the stereotype that uptalk will always lead to perceptions of reduced credibility, it also shows us that as analysts, we cannot settle for simple definitions and instead need to develop more nuanced accounts of the social meaning of linguistic forms. So this is just how listeners perceive uptalk. But then the second question was, what effect do gender ideologies have on these perceptions? And I think that the results have shown that they have quite profound effects, at least in certain contexts. We see that in the context of a rape trial, men as defendants are able to have their credibility enhanced by things like uptalk. They can be made to sound more credible. This is paired with an overall boost that's given to them by dominant gender stereotypes, which also independently enhance men's perceived credibility. So endorsement of rape myths makes a man sound more credible. Uptalk makes the man sound more credible, right? So they have all these ways to sound more credible. Women, in contrast, appear to be ineligible to have their credibility boosted, at least by a feature like uptalk. Instead, we see that their epistemic authority is subject to questioning, as shown by the order effect. So if the defendant presents his version of events, then we'll perhaps doubt the woman's credibility, whereas that didn't happen for the man. And that while men are helped by gender stereotypes, women are hindered by these same popular gendered ideologies, as shown by the interaction of the rape myth acceptance score and order, such that not only is women's credibility undermined by the defendant's testimony, high rape myth acceptance scores also serve to undermine women's credibility overall. Overall, it's clear then that in certain contexts and on the surface level of practice, the place where judgments of truth and credibility are formed, women and men are subject to unequal interpretive constraints. Constraints that appear designed to provide men with the opportunity to have their credibility enhanced, while women's credibility is only ever questioned and diminished. Ultimately, then, we come back full circle with new empirical evidence to support Gilmore's assertion that women encounter doubt as a condition of bearing witness, a condition which Gilmore argues renders women, by definition, what she calls tainted witnesses. Now, I realize that this is a somewhat depressing place to end, but I think it's a nevertheless important one, since, as Gilmore further notes, a focus on tainted witnesses is not simply a reiteration that we should listen to women's voices. It's an analysis of how women's voices emerge as subject to doubt. I hope today to have contributed one small piece to that analytical project. And just to close, I want to think briefly about what we can do next. And I think this is actually a hard question to answer. If there were an uptalk effect, we could perhaps use that to educate, in the rape trial context I'm speaking of. If there were an uptalk effect, we could perhaps use that to educate people, to explain that uptalk does not necessarily mean that women or complainants are uncertain of what they're saying, This solution would, of course, run the risk of policing women's language, which is another thing that we have to be careful of, and reproducing the idea that women need to change how they behave in order to conform with dominant stereotypes. But in this case, we don't even have such an effect. In many ways, this means that what we're dealing with here, at least in the rape trial context, isn't a linguistic problem in the strictest sense. It's a social problem, albeit one that linguistic evidence helps us to see more clearly. So to close, I'd like to reiterate a statement that I heard in a talk yesterday by Jade Dew from Newcastle University, which I thought was very well put, that just because women have the right to speak does not necessarily mean that they have a voice. And it's this larger issue that I think we need to address. Thank you.